It was just really important for them to call me Chief. Hi, Chief.
I mean, the reality is, whoever's sitting in the big chair, everybody's sort of playing to you. That's just the way it is.
I always had this vision when I was doing the op-ed page column, and my children were pretty small then, that someday one of them, on some issue, would turn to me and say, "What did you do in the revolution, Mommy?" And I would be able to say, this.
This program is made possible by support from the following. The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation promotes excellence in journalism worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities. The Whitehead Foundation. And by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
On the website, www.npr.org. This is Morning Edition on NPR News.
This is the story of 10 women in positions of power. In one of the world's most powerful industries.
How do you get it there? Were they in?
The industry that defines what's important. What matters. And how we live our lives. Ten women, bringing a distinctly female sensibility to journalism, changing the story of our times, changing the culture, and changing the world.
No, you can't fast forward because you'll miss the beginning.
Since the days of the women's movement, the ranks of women in television newsrooms across the country have tripled. The percentage of female news directors almost 50 times greater than 3 decades ago. And almost 20% of newspaper editors are women.
We can. I mean, there's no reason not to.
More women in decision-making positions now than any time in the nation's history. How are women in news changing the news and the landscape of American journalism? These are the questions we put to the women who put the questions to the world.
Happy Sunday, everybody!
Ladies and gentlemen, the news ladies in the building.
We got lots of news for you, darling.
A lot of news today.
Well, I'm so glad you're back.
Oh, thank you.
Did you see the stuff I left in your chair?
Yes!
Once again, China's the big story today. The network's all China, China, China.
Do we know how much the Chinese have seen about this? How much have they put on their news over there?
I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, and all of those aspects of my life, I think, inform what I do as a journalist.
I have a perspective that a white male does not have. I think you could send me and a white reporter to see the same event, and that both of us will come out with a completely different point of view.
It just seems to me that over and over again I see stories that couldn't be covered as well if there were not people who knew them from the inside out, i.e. female members of the staff. I think I felt that most keenly on 2 stories. The first was when Geraldine Ferraro was the vice presidential nominee, and there was a lot of Sturm und Drang about whether we should call her Ms. Ferraro or Mrs. Ferraro or Miss Ferraro. And I think doing the right thing on that story was frequently informed by women. There were frequently times where we raised our hands and said, hey, if we're going to describe her suit, we got to describe his suit. And then the whole notion of describing the suit was clearly revealed as so silly that it never happened at all. The second was on the Anita Hill story.
The hearing will come to order.
For women who could identify with Anita Hill and with these accusations of sexual harassment in the workplace, this was like, a click that went off in their brains. Okay, we in fact, we called it at the LA Times the click. We wrote a story about it. But we were really late on it because there were women in the Washington Bureau who wanted to write that story immediately, and men didn't get it. The men in the Washington Bureau didn't get it, the male editors.
I remember at the time men saying to me, why, did you see the percentage of women who say they've been sexually harassed, And we're kind of going, no, duh. I mean, of course we knew that this was true, but it hadn't made it into the news.
When I first got wind of the fact that there was a woman who was making allegations of sexual harassment against Clarence Thomas, who had been the head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and whose job it was to enforce laws against sex discrimination, I thought that was a pretty important story. And when I talked to some of the Democratic members of the Judiciary Committee who knew about it, they said to me, oh, this is no silver bullet, Nina, you shouldn't pay much attention to this. And I was genuinely surprised, I guess. I couldn't understand why this wasn't an issue. And I turned to my husband, my late husband, who was then living and fine, and I give him a lot of credit for this. He said, I don't know why that shouldn't be an issue. If it's true, it's very serious misbehavior and abuse of an employee. And I began to pursue it.
According to Hill's affidavit, Thomas, after a brief work discussion, would, quote, turn conversation to discussions about his sexual interests. His conversations, she said, were vivid.
When I walked into the Capitol on Monday morning, the place was erupting. The fax machines were vaporizing, the phones were jammed. I was almost as surprised as those male senators were. They could not push through a vote the next day as they had hoped.
Professor, do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Almost every woman had had experiences with, quote, sexual harassment of varying kinds. I remember when I used to walk down the hall at the National Observer, the printers used to line up and dissect my body, sort of piece by piece. When I was in the Capitol and walked through the Speaker's lobby, members of Congress would sit on the benches and catcall me. And I was embarrassed. I'm not going to tell you I was deeply traumatized. I was a pretty tough young cookie. I was not deeply traumatized. It just was extremely not fun.
Can you tell the committee what was the most embarrassing of all the incidences that you have alleged?
I think the one that was the most embarrassing was his discussion of pornography involving these women with large breasts and engaged in a variety of sex with different people or animals. That was the thing that embarrassed me the most and made me feel the most humiliated.
If that behavior were to exist today, it would blow the roof off of places. Things really have changed in part because we've discussed it.
Women's reporting on it made it the story it was. I don't think it would have been that story if men had been the only ones in those political reporting positions.
In the aftermath, women serve on the Judiciary Committee of the Senate. The numbers of sexual harassment suits filed just zoomed upward. Women started chattering to each other about this and finding out that they weren't the only ones. And employers found out it was going on and that they had to do something about it.
Newsrooms really were very traditional macho places. For most of us coming into newsrooms 30 years ago, say, but the pressure was to be just as macho, just as unfeeling, just as rigorous about exactly what news judgment meant. You didn't come in and say, oh, there's this really interesting thing happening in the classroom, if in fact you were supposed to be covering the Board of Education. You sort of got your cues, and the last thing you wanted to do was stand out and be different. You were already different, you were a girl.
When I started out at one of the wire services, I had a bureau chief who thought it was really amusing to come by and snap my bra while I was sitting there working on deadline and say, "Twang, twang, Robin Hood." And I was mortified. But after I got over my initial embarrassment, I'm one of those people, when I get embarrassed, I get a little speechless, that I just simply turned around and said, "Don't do that, that's not funny."
The ABC affiliate news director sat down, we had a good conversation, we talked about what we want to do. He offered me the job. There I was, a senior at Duke, majoring in political science, and I was so excited. Then as I get up to leave, he says, "And by the way, how could I not hire somebody with legs like yours?"
One of the worst things, because I had never seen anything like this before, and they did this several times, was to open the door to the announce booth and drop their pants and moon me while I was on the air. And what this ended up doing was making me stronger than ever. My powers of concentration are amazing because I was put through the fire. In fact, they even set fire to my pages one time.
There were always some reporters, women reporters, who went covering wars and so forth, but they were few and far between. Sarah McClendon stands out as outstanding. There was May Craig. Liz Carpenter was terrific. She got us into the balcony in the National Press Club in 1956 when she became president of the Women's Press Club. And so many women really, I think, were real leaders and fighters. News is news, and you'll know it when you see it. I don't think it's a question of gender at all.
This is Nancy Honchman, and this is Captain Grissom's house in Newport News, Virginia. Inside, his wife Betty and their two little boys, Scott and Mark, watched and waited.
If the American people allow Khrushchev to do this, then the tiger is truly within the gates. This is Pauline Frederick, NBC News at the United Nations.
Mrs. Eisenhower, maybe we can clear up some misconceptions today. There was some thought that your husband was not a great reader, that really all he read was Westerns, but this is not true.
Well, that's only because he was a very deep reader.
Food is adequate, rice is the main dish, but the kitchen is in poor condition, and the soldiers of the 578th hope to make improvements in the future. Marlene Sanders, ABC, Zem Moi, South Vietnam.
The great thing is that editors no longer discriminate as to whether you are a woman or a man. They just want you to produce. Ladies first.
Ladies first.
Yeah.
Hi, Helen.
How are you? My public demands.
Your retinue.
Yeah, there is acceptance now, but every door had to be broken down separately. The National Press Club, the White House Correspondents Association, the Gridiron Club were all exclusively male. Little by little, after World War II, we began to break down some of these barriers, but it was a long, long time.
President, your press secretary says that you're considering new emergency measures if the recession worsens. What are these new measures, and what would trigger the new initiatives? What developments? Specifically, how high would unemployment have to go?
Congratulations on your new success in joining the Gridiron Club.
Answer
you
the
made
question.
it unanimously, too. Well, to answer your question, the action that I took today...
we didn't actually get become members or allowed to become members of the National Press Club till 1971. That's a long way from 1920 when women got the vote and so forth. So it's been a struggle.
There were all these women before me upon whose shoulders I got to climb. There were a lot of women who made it safe for me to be the first op-ed page columnist on the paper, I think, who wrote in a kind of a flagrantly female vein. At the time, Anne O'Hare McCormick and Flora Lewis were writing their columns. the goal was really to blend in. The goal was really to be as much one of the boys as possible. I got to be the first wave of the we're not the boys anymore. The issue is, do the men in the office approach this in a different fashion? One, do they even think about asking for time off?
Well, I'm told that the men are also...
When I first started at the New York Times in 1977, I used to go to the ladies' room all the time. I think everyone thought that I had a weak bladder, but I actually was looking for friends. And an awful lot of them turned out to be clerks because women hadn't been hired at the same level that I was. But there was this core group of us who I thought of as the class of 1977. We were the direct response to a suit called Boylan v. Times, which was a class action brought by 6 women at the paper, charging that it didn't hire, promote, or pay women in parity with men. And so suddenly they hired this crew of us. Once you got in, it was just like 2 questions. Can she deliver, and will she cry? The second was fatal. I mean, there were times when I'd just been ripped up and down in a very loud voice at the desk of an editor, and I just, and maybe 15 minutes later I went into the ladies' room and just shook, but you never let them see you shake. It was hard because you didn't want to ghettoize yourself. I was asked that all the time about my op-ed page column. Well, if you write about childcare, and you write about abortion, and you write about feminism, and you write about sexual harassment, aren't you sort of ghettoizing yourself in the girl group? The answer I had was that those were the cutting-edge issues of the end of the 20th century, and that my colleagues were excellent columnists, but they didn't seem that inclined to cover those issues. And I wrote conspicuously as a woman. This is why I believe Anita Hill. This is why I feel so strongly about parental notification. This is why we need a national child care policy. There was that sense of bringing the public and private together that I think was particularly female. He finished his biopsy. He was feeling fine. Okay. Last night, after a speech, a woman came up to me and said, I don't know if you remember a column you wrote called Enough Closet Space, and I did. But at the time that you wrote it, our son had just come out to us. And after reading that column, my husband and I treated him entirely differently than we would have had we not read it. I made one gay guy's life a little bit better by sitting down and cranking out a scant 730 words. That's astonishing to me. It's astonishing to me that I have the opportunity to do that and the privilege.
It used to be said, well, you can't be an editor, with a finger to the wind. Well, of course not. But you do need to be an editor who understands that you're having a real impact on your community. We'll have a really good day, sweetie. I hope the test goes well.
Okay.
Are you dreading it?
No. It'll be fun. Have a good day.
We will.
Okay.
I'll never forget going to the cop shop when I was first a reporter at the Colorado Springs Sun, and of course no woman reporter had ever gone in there. And the cop looked at me and he said, well, I can't show you these pink slips, the records of the crime, because there's rapes in here. And I said, well, there's women in those rapes. But he wouldn't let me look at them. There was a long-time journalistic tradition of not using the names of rape victims because of the special stigma attached to rape. But it had always bothered me that this was the only case of adult victims of crime in which newspapers didn't use the name. And I had always felt that this contributed to society's feeling that if you've been raped, boy, don't tell anyone about it, and this sort of notion that you need to slink into a corner in the dark and be ashamed, as if somehow you had participated in this. So it had always bugged me, and I'd always thought when I heard editors talk about it that it was fairly paternalistic sounding. Oh, we're going to protect the little lady, you know. So I had written an op-ed piece in the Des Moines Register, my newspaper, and I said I worry about the impact on rape victims and on society's failure really to focus on this crime. One day, I pick up the phone, I get this, this woman with a muffled, sort of crying sounding voice saying that she wanted to talk to me. And a newspaper editor, on any given day I could have taken it or not taken it. I could have said, really sorry, call back another time, talk to my secretary. Because you get calls from all kinds of people, and some of them really are kooks, and somebody calling and saying, I want to come in and talk to you. Anyway, I said, fine. She drove in. She came into my office. I didn't know what it was about. She said, I was raped, and I want to tell my story. I want you to take my picture. I want to be on the record. Nancy Ziegenmeyer was a woman in Grinnell, Iowa, who had driven into Des Moines about an hour's drive one morning to take a real estate exam, and she was in her car in the dark morning, and this total stranger broke into the car and raped her. Months later, this wonderful reporter of ours, a woman named Jane Shore, turned in this marvelous piece that really looked at this rape forthrightly. Nancy Ziegenmeyer had been brave about this, and we were determined to meet her courage with our own frankness in presenting it. And it would say things like, after he had ejaculated, and I was watching electronically over the shoulder of our very good copy editor who was copy editing it, and I saw that he changed that to when he had finished, as if the guy were having lunch. So I said, reinstate after he had ejaculated. This is reality. Let's deal with the crime. Now, one of my colleagues came in to me and he said, I really think this is going to be difficult for blue-haired ladies and 15-year-old girls. I'll never forget the phrase. And I was telling him why I thought this was important to do and why I thought it would reach people. He said, why don't you write that? And it's really because of him that I wrote this editor's note that I do think made a difference.
Were you at all prepared for the reaction that you got after the series of articles appeared?
Oh, absolutely not. Geneva Overholzer, the editor of the Des Moines Register, said to me at one point, Nancy, your life is going to change after this. But I don't think Geneva nor myself had any idea how much my life would change.
I will always be grateful to Nancy Ziegenmeyer for being willing to say, I'm a rape victim and I don't want to hide. But in the end, I don't think it was the little old ladies and the 15-year-old girls who had trouble. I think it was the men who had trouble. But people of both sexes and all ages welcomed this as an important piece of journalism. I think readers are willing to be shocked, they're willing to read difficult things, but we as editors have to be far more willing to help them see why we did it. I think that's one thing that women editors may be more willing to do. Editors have been like medical people. It's like a priesthood, or this is Greek to you. We can't really let you in on the secrets, what goes on behind the scenes. We need to let people in on the secrets. We need to let them know we struggle over these decisions, and we need to let them know we care about how it affects them.
New York Post, 25 cents. Thank you.
Younger women find it funny, but every expression of irritation on the part of a woman was attributed to the fact that she had her period. When I was getting into difficulty with the CBS brass towards the end of my stay, they said that I was premenopausal. There was always an attitude that we had a different kind of emotional track. One of the first pieces I ever did was on menopause. And I called the piece The Last Dirty Word. And the men were horrified by that piece, absolutely horrified. We were constantly, the first wave of us was trying to push back those barnacles that had stuck to our brains since childhood that said that we were the second sex, that we were inferior creatures, that men knew everything. There was an assumption when I first became a producer that I would wash the dishes when we worked late at night. The boys, even if they worked for me, they didn't do that kind of stuff. It was woman's work. And one day I rebelled and I said, you guys pick up the dirty plates and take them to the sink. It's just that simple. But we had, we were in a box, and some of us were programmed to want to climb out. When women first began going into news, the outside world didn't take us seriously. And that was a marvelous advantage as a woman. You could get people to open up, and I made a couple of really important on-air scoops simply because people would get lured into talking.
We know that land-based missiles and bombers cannot be launched independently. They have built-in technical safeguards. But what about the submarine? It has never been admitted publicly before, but Admiral Powell Carter confirmed to us for the first time that yes, the submarine commander and his crew have the capability to launch their nuclear missiles in a crisis if they have lost communications with the command structure. These men have the capability to wage a nuclear war all by themselves.
I was of a generation that was very authority bound, and you weren't supposed to, if you worked for CBS News, have positions, emotional, intellectual, or otherwise. But I think that women, certainly in the early days, often saw the major issues of our time in relationship to themselves and to their families. I had 4 children, and they were being taught to duck and cover in school, to get under a desk to hide from nuclear bombs, which struck me as the most absurd thing I'd ever heard. So the nuclear battlefield grew directly out of my own feelings. The notion of my kids or anybody's kids fighting on a nuclear battlefield was beyond consideration. Dick Salant, who had been the president of CBS News and was a wonderful man, and I used to argue all the time. He argued that a reporter's responsibility was to be objective, and I argued that our responsibility was to be fair. I insisted that I had lived too long, that there was too much in my life to pretend that I was objective, but that I could promise to be fair. And I don't think he ever accepted my position. I know I never accepted his.
Everyone has what they believe in their own mind is the truth. One of the things that I've done here on the editorial page is to start a format that's like a pro and con format, where we'll have one side of the issue and the other arguments, and then we'll have our view. And I found readers respect that so much. But you can't please everybody. I'll never forget one of my first weeks on the job. Somebody was angry about an editorial, and they were going to come down and demonstrate, throw bricks through the window. And I said, well, I must be doing great because people are talking about blowing up the building. What you strive for is to lay out what you think is an opinion with integrity, a thoughtful opinion, a well-grounded opinion. I don't believe in sort of cheap shot editorializing, like calling people pond scum, that kind of thing. It might be kind of fun, but I don't think it builds trust with readers, and they're not going to come back to you and believe in you and trust you if you do that. I've probably had a tendency to look at some of the human side of both the news stories and the editorials. Not that men aren't human, but I think they're more intrigued with the politics, with the game.
Ready to meet? Oh, I'm not ready. Wait. Ready to meet?
My style is soft in that I try to be people sensitive. I think that's an asset because this is a very people intensive business. Either you're dealing with writers, and let's face it, you know, it's not like running a chicken factory. Trying to get writers to produce is like trying to get eggs from peacocks.
I can do it in 300 words.
Could we make it the lead on Sunday? You got to work with them. This is a good mix. I've got China, I've got Cincinnati, I've got 10%.
In order for those positions to have...
I've always tried to run my department in a real HR sensitive way. We've had this long-standing rule that if anybody needs to bring their kids down here, they do. One of our editorial writers has two little girls, and they were down here, and they did a portrait of me, and this is the boss, and it's me with the dress on. And I thought, well, that's great. I'll just save that.
One good thing here is that you can throw out subject matter and not feel that necessarily, do it because I said so, but that all opinions value and have some worth.
Marina leads a lot by example, and I don't know, is that a woman thing or a man thing? I don't know. She's the hardest working person in the building, as far as I can tell, and I don't think anyone would disagree with it. And that's a daunting example to have set for you.
These guys are spoiled. I've worked for men my whole life, and this is the first woman I've worked for, and it's quite a difference.
People who work for newspapers give a lot.
Being sensitive.
I'll never forget my oldest son, when he was a senior in high school, was playing football. And the first game of the season coincided with our executive retreat in Austin. And I thought, oh, darn, I'm going to have to. I was being really careful not to schedule anything for those Friday nights to be out of town, but I really had to be at that executive meeting. And I thought, well, it's the first game. It's a long season. There'll be 11 or 12 more games. Well, wouldn't you know it, somebody tackled him from the side and broke his leg so that he was knocked out of varsity training, and I was down in Austin. I felt terrible. I started to cry that I couldn't be there. I'll never forgive myself for that. He did, but I won't.
I was going to write about adoption today because it's on my mind, and now that baby that was killed was an adopted baby, and I really feel that. I feel sorry about that. I will see you later.
Go through the second half of the script here as if we're going to track it this way. I just have a feeling.
What is interesting is
here we go. Riverfront Business
any specific description of the attack itself.
The other passengers on board the missionary plane returned home today.
So for example, the soundbite from the aviation director, this is a good soundbite
today about their terrifying ordeal.
Yes, that's
today we have this terrible plane crash in Peru where missionaries were killed.
Stand by, everybody. Quiet, please.
The guys get all excited that the CIA might have been involved.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Carol Simpson. We know more tonight about the deadly attack on a missionary flight in Peru Friday and about the American connection to the accident.
But I think our viewers are also interested in who are these people? How are people reacting? How are people feeling?
Michigan, hundreds gathered to mourn their loss at the church that's home to the missionaries.
We don't ever want to forget the human aspect. The guys would like to dismiss that as touchy-feely. Oh, yes, they want the touchy-feely. And we're not hard news people. To me, that's as much of the story as anything else.
Back in 30.
For years, ABC News had a series called American Agenda. And for 8 years, that ended up being the most satisfying part of my career because I was able to do stories about juvenile crime and about domestic abuse and about rape and about poverty and things like that. But we don't have American Agenda anymore. We have gone to focus groups. We have found out that people are suffering compassion fatigue. So it's kind of a depressing time right now because I don't think we are fulfilling what I always thought was our historic function, and that was to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. We don't do very much of that anymore. When you think that the population is still more than half female, and you think about who is making the decisions in broadcasting, I think we are still doing a disservice to the American people because what we are presenting, and I say that about all of the networks and all the news organizations, is still for the most part a white male perspective. And it's actually a white upper middle class, middle-aged perspective.
45 back, not this time.
It's Sunday. And if you look around our newsroom, there are 2 Asians, 2 African-American males. If you were to look upstairs at our editing suites, and if you'd look on the floor of the studio, you would see America represented. If you came in here tomorrow, on Monday, you would see a completely different picture. You would see no people of color sitting on that rim. You would not see very many women, and I think you see quite a few women here today. If you had asked me in 1974, when I started in network television, that in the year 2001, we would still have 3 white male anchors on the evening newscasts, I would have said, impossible.
Benjamin, you're not going to be late this morning, right? Run. Benjamin?
I can't even remember what it was like not to try to juggle kids and their schedule and their doctor's appointments and their play dates.
And running. You've got 0 minutes to get there.
And their homework and their lives, all that.
21st wedding anniversary.
Sweetheart, it seems like just yesterday.
Along with the demands of the full-time career of a journalist. My husband writes a column in the Journal on Thursday, so I have to be sure to look at it. But I didn't look at it this morning, so before I see anybody, I like to know what he said. Early on, when I went to work as a reporter, I thought of myself as lucky to even have a job. Then after a time, I was started to co-anchor the evening news at 6 o'clock. It was brought to my attention that my male co-anchor, because there was an article about it in the paper, was making considerably more than I was. And so I went to the station manager and sat down with him, and I said, you know, what is the story here? I do every bit as much as my co-anchor. I even, I cover the legislature. All he does is anchor news shows. And his answer was, well, you're making very good money for a woman, Judy. I remember nodding and saying, well, yes, that's true. I think I make good money, but you know, what about this disparity here? And he really didn't have an answer for me.
Well, and
Clearly, now that there are so many more women in this business, I think the sensitivity is increased. I've always wanted to have a family, and I've always wanted my career. I do not believe that in the beginning I had an inkling of how complicated that was going to turn out to be. Our first child, Jeffrey, was born with spina bifida, which turns out is the most commonly occurring disabling birth defect. But he was born with a very mild form of it. He was walking on time. He did everything all the other kids were doing. And then at the age of 16, he went into the hospital for what was supposed to be a routine procedure, and the surgery went awry. And he came out of it a profoundly different person. Okay, now you're going to do this transfer. His speech is affected, his vision, his left eyelid is closed. He has to have a full-time companion. There we go, sweetie. Open that up. He's my hero. Al's and my hero because he's just so courageous. He knows everything that's happened to him. It's almost as if he's trapped inside a body and he just can't get it out. You don't have a fever, but your neck is definitely swollen. Anyone who's a mother or a father understands that the last thing on earth you want to have happen is anything to your child. You'd rather have it happen to you. You're going to have to finish that orange juice this morning, you know that?
What?
You're going to have to finish your orange juice. The orange juice police are here. It's very painful, but you just keep going. You don't have any choice.
Mom.
What?
Never mind.
Am I giving you a hard time?
Yeah.
How big?
Very big.
CNN was great. They gave me a lot of time off, but I think it's made me a more sensitive reporter. I'm much more aware now of people with disabilities, and I thought I was open-minded. I thought I was understanding. Now it's a whole different world.
Now, Judy Woodruff takes you inside politics.
Thank you for joining us. President Bush added his voice today to the expression of regret over the loss of a Chinese pilot in that collision between an American spy plane and a Chinese fighter jet.
I've wanted to be in a place where I could make a difference in this business, a place where I could be making some of the decisions about what we cover and how we cover them, the questions that are asked. It's crucial that women be in the room when decisions are made because women are more than half of society. We are more than half of the electorate in this country.
Carl,
Process.
okay.
Republican leaders have Vermont Republicans after the meeting. Jeffords sent Cheney a letter formally rejecting.
I think younger women have been torn to pieces over the issue of work and home. And I don't think the women's movement has helped at all. I think all the issues of daycare and flexible time and all the accommodations, the human accommodations we could make to each other, we've simply not yet grappled with. So I think there is a real burden, and your love life suffers, and your married life suffers, and your home life suffers, and you better have a lot of energy.
And then maybe we'll go after dinner tomorrow night to celebrate our anniversary, since we're not going to do it tonight.
Instead of tonight?
Why don't we do it tonight?
Well, I think we ought to take the kids, don't you?
Oh, I thought you'd say that.
I think there are not more women in management for several reasons. Part of it has been that women have not wanted to make the sacrifice that's required. I mean, when you're a manager, you are always on call. It's 24/7. And some women have felt, as I felt, that, you know, I want to be available as much as I can, but I want to reserve a piece of my life for my family, for my children.
Hey, Judy.
Hi there. How are you, stranger? So I've limited myself professionally that way, and I'm sure that's affected my career.
Was it about?
Now, having said that, I think we need to change the definition of what a good manager is and understand that they are going to have some time off with their families, because then they're better managers. They make better decisions, men and women.
What's news in this business is what's on the front page. And when you change the kinds of stories that go on the front page and have them be more family-oriented and more health-oriented and more education-oriented, then you're changing the definition of news.
All right.
There's a saying in the business that nothing's a story until it happens to an editor. I think that's true about being a parent and being a grandparent.
All right.
You really want to do those stories that you can relate to.
I was telling you.
Stories that used to be perceived as soft stories, so-called soft stories, I hate that term. It implies that there's something squishy about it or mushy about it. All of these stories that used to be perceived as women's stories now have come to be perceived as stories that are of interest to everyone. It is difficult leaving the LA Times, packing up 31 years of files, deciding what to toss and what to keep.
These are all my women's files right here, going back the 3 women's organizations that I helped start here. It's like, well, that's really history.
At one point in my career, I oversaw all the feature sections at the LA Times when I first was made associate editor, and I had to be dragged kicking and screaming to that job. I had so wanted to stay away from that stereotype of being a woman being on the feature side of the paper that when the editor of the Times asked me to take that job, I said, you know, I'll do it as a favor to you, but only as a favor and only temporarily. And I ended up growing to love it because I realized, you know, the more I talked to readers, the more I realized that they really loved that part of the paper. That was the part of the paper where people could read stories that could help them cope with their lives. The part of the paper that people could really relate to. Over time, as more women transitioned from the feature side of the paper to the news side of the paper, I think they brought with them, you know, that sensitivity to those kinds of stories.
There's more bright writing in most newspapers. There's more first-person stuff in most newspapers, and more coverage of what we call lifestyle. Some of that is because newspapers had to change, but some of it is because women changed newspapers.
Jay Johnson from the Page One desk.
I've just been hired to be the senior editor of the San Francisco Chronicle.
Mike Wogeliner on the Page One desk.
This is very exciting for me at this point in my career because I've noticed that at my age, when women kind of hit their 50s, I look at the people I know in journalism, whether it's television, radio, or newspapers, the people whose careers have capped and who've gone off into other things like maybe teaching journalism in college or becoming heads of foundations or whatever, they're women. And more often than not, if you look at the editors, the oldest editors in America are all men. I'm 54. I still have many years ahead of me in journalism. I would just love this new challenge to be really active in a new newsroom.
How does the chair feel?
Let me see. Oh, feels good. I was here a week ago and this was used as a storage room for desks and whatnot, computers, and so they've made a lot of progress in a week.
There were not very many women in prominent spots when she ascended at the LA Times, and I think she sort of set a standard for how you comport yourself, what ideas you push, how to make newsrooms operate well. Newspapers are managed differently and better because of the large number of women who have ascended to positions of prominence and authority.
They're more comfortable with the notion that you bring people on board, you make sure you've checked with a lot of folks before you make a decision, that it's not just a my way or the highway.
I found that if you're in that top top job, you have a lot more luxury of comfort with who you are, with being different, with having a different style. I mean, you know, I cried. These people had never seen an editor who cried. I cried sometimes, and people would be in my office and something really terrible would be happening, and I'd cry, and the men would kind of look around like, what do we do now? You know, do we comfort her? She's the boss.
I think that having women in the newsroom and having women in assignment positions, bringing these stories onto the front page, you know, has really created a difference in the culture of the newsroom.
Probably my race, my gender, slowed down the process for me becoming a news director in New York. I'd estimate that it probably took about 2 years too long. That amount of time frustrated me like crazy back then. It really just made the veins pop out in my neck. I was so angry at times. But, you know, ultimately it happened. It's a little blemished. They're beautiful. My parents are immigrants. I grew up on welfare in New York, ran the streets of Harlem, college and high school on scholarship. I grew up not the way most news directors grew up. It's interesting that every person who's ever promoted me was a white male. So it's a little too simplistic to believe that only people of color or only women can understand and can move, you know, can move the agenda.
What side of the airport is this thing? Is it?
Many years ago when I got my first job in television, and Marty Haig, who was the news director at WFAA at the time, and Dave Lane, who was the general manager of the station, had decided that, you know, I was a keeper. They had brought me over from newspapers. They wanted to teach me television. And I said, Marty, how are you going to teach me television? People go to school for that. He said, just sit next to me. He said, anything that happens in this station that you have a question about. I mean, one time I went to him and I said, Marty, I'd like to make some changes in this memo because the way it's written as sent can be very, very painful. He said, well, that's how I want it. I said, no, we don't want it that way. Let's think about having a, you know, a positive outcome where you don't have to really just, you know, zing the person. And he would let me do that. When I was named news director at WNBC on that day, I remember calling him in Dallas and saying, Marty, this is Paula. He greeted me, and I said, guess who I am? He said, you're Paula. I said, no, Marty, guess who I am? He said, you're Paula. I said, no, Marty, think about it. Guess who I am? He said, you're the news director at WNBC. And I said, Marty, you made it happen. And I hung up the phone, I sat in my office, and I had a little time to cry. I was so happy. It didn't mean I was the only one able. It meant that at that time, when that opportunity was presented, I was in a place and time and ready to accept the position. But I guarantee you, there were hundreds, if not thousands of women before me who could have done these jobs. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of African Americans before me who could have done these jobs, and children of immigrants.
Do you consider yourself ambitious for power?
First, ambitious for power.
Yes, I want more power.
I mean, power for myself, not ambitious for power. I am ambitious for the ability to make a change.
I once got a Peabody Award, and I looked out over the room, and I was amazed after years in which I was the only woman in the room to see just hundreds of women in this banquet room. And then I looked up to the network execs who were giving the award, and I pointed to them and I said, maybe someday there'll be a skirt up there too.
To order She Says Women in News on video cassette, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-PLAY-PBS.
Susan Bischoff, Houston Chronicle. Harley Morgan, Columbia University.
Karen Jurgensen, USA Today. Gloria Anderson, New York Times. Dania Friend, Charleston Daily Mail.
Rena Peterson, Dallas Morning News.
Linda Lightfoot, Baton Rouge Advocate. Rita Henley Jensen, Women's E-News. Ellen Goodman, Boston Globe. Renee Loth, Boston Globe.
Pam Johnson, most recently of the Arizona Republic, on my way to the Poynter Institute faculty.
Sue Hale, the Daily Oklahoman.
Jennifer Carroll with Gannett.
Diana Smith, Reed Brennan Media Associates. Tondra Rush, American Press Works. Carol Pierce, National Federation of Press Women.
Jan Tuckwood, the Palm Beach Post.
Julia Wallace, Atlanta Journal and Constitution. Marsha Bullard, USA Weekend.
Ellen Soderbergh, St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
Carol Steisel, Foundation for American Communications.
Charlotte Hall, Newsday.
This program is made possible by support from the following. The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation promotes excellence in journalism worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities. The Whitehead Foundation, in memory of Nancy Dickerson Whitehead. And by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.